So, good afternoon, everyone. I am the presenter for this afternoon. I am Melvin G. Arambala from BSL English 3B. In this video, I am going to present and discuss a sociolinguistic model of narrative. So, without further ado, let us begin. So, this unit makes some practical suggestions for exploring further the structure of narrative. It draws upon one particular model of narrative, the framework of natural narrative developed by the sociolinguist William Labov. Labov's concept of narrative structure, which has already featured in this strand A5, has proved a productive model of analysis and stylistics. After a brief sketch of the model, some narrative texts will be introduced and some particular activities develop around them. So William Labov is an American linguist widely regarded as the founder of the discipline of variationist sociolinguistics. Since it is based on a specific narrative model, the Labov model provides practical suggestions for exploring narrative structure. And the concepts of Labov's narrative structure has already been mentioned and proven to be a useful analytical and stylistic model. So let's go to the Labov's narrative model. Labov's narrative model was elaborated on the basis of spoken corpus of hundreds of stories told in the context everyday conversation. He identified 6 core recurrent features or categories underpinning a polyform natural narrative. Each category addresses one what questions. What is this story about? Where did the story take place? Each category fulfills a different function in the story. So, the Labov model is based on a 100-story corpus of everyday conversation. 6 central categories of a polyform natural narrative are also identified by Labov's. Then, he asks 1 questions about each category, such as what is the story about and where did the story take place. The enduring appeal of Labov's model of natural narrative is largely because its origins are situated in the everyday discourse practices of real speakers and real social contexts. Working from a corpus of hundreds of stories told in the course of casual conversation by informants from many different backgrounds, Labov isolates the core, recurrent features that underpin a fully formed natural narrative. 6 key categories are rendered down from his body of data. Each of these categories serves to address hypothetical questions about narrative structure. What is this story about? Where did it take place? And so on. So each category fulfills a different function and a story. So Labov's natural narrative model is based on his examinations of hundreds of stories told in casual conversation by people from various backgrounds. 6 key categories are distilled down from the core features that underpin a fully formed natural narrative, each of which addresses a hypothetical question about narrative structure. So the table C5.1 lists the 6 categories, the hypothetical questions they address in their respective narrative functions. The table also provides information on the sort of linguistic forms that each component typically takes. With the exceptions of evaluation, the categories listed on the table are arranged in the sequence in which they would occur in a typical oral narrative. Evaluation to sit outside the central pattern because it can be inserted at virtually any stage during a narrative. The table C5.1 lists the 6 elements of a typical oral narrative, as well as the questions and responses given to them. The table categories are listed in the order in which they would appear in a typical oral narrative. Evaluation is also the most fluid of the narrative categories stylistically. It make a variety of linguistic forms depending on what particular evaluate job it is doing. However, the insertion of evaluative device is generally very important as it helps explains the relevance of the central reportable events of a story. A fully formed narrative will realize all 6 categories, although many narratives may lack one or more components. So evaluation, beginnings, middles, and ends of narrative have been analyzed in many accounts of folklore or narrative. But there is one more important aspect of narrative which has not been discussed, perhaps the most important element in addition to the basic narrative prose. So that is what we term the evaluation of the narrative, the means used by the narrator to indicate the point of the narrative, its reason to be, why it was told, and what the narrator is getting at. There are many ways to tell the same story, to make very different points or to make no points at all. So the narrator's method of indicating the narrative's point, its reason for being, why it was told, and what was the narrator is getting at is called narrative evaluation. There are numerous ways to tell the same story, make drastically different points, or make no points at all. So, pointless stories are met in English with the withering rejoinder. So what? Every good narrator is continually wording of this question. When the narrative is over, it should be unthinkable for a bystander to say, "So what?" Instead, the appropriate remark would be, "He did," or similar means of registering the reportable character of the events of the narrative. So, evaluative devices include direct statements, but more importantly, they include also responses to the action presented as part of the story. It closed my eyes and thought I was going to die. Intensifying devices both of sound and word choice, including the repetition. One of Labab's example is part of a secretary's account of a hair racing plane trip in which the plane almost didn't get over the mountain. Her narrative is punctuated with the most comments such as, "In it was the strangest feeling because you couldn't tell if they were really going to make it." So, evaluative devices include direct statements, but more importantly, responses to the action presented as part of the story. Intensifying devices both of sound and word choice, including repetition. One of the above example is part of a secretary's account of a hair racing plane trip, in which the plane almost didn't get over the mountains. So this is the table of Labab's model of narrative. So there are 6 categories. For the first categories, the abstract. For the second, orientation. For the third, complicating action. Fourth, resolution. Fifth, evaluation. And the last, which is the coda. So for the abstract, the narrative question, what was this about? And the narrative function signals that the story is about to begin and draws attention from listener. So for the linguistic form, a short summarizing statement provided before the narrative commences. So for this category, as a result, the learners are having difficulty understanding the abstract in this section because it aids the listener in summarizing their own understanding of the story in this category. As a result, assist listeners in expanding their understanding of the story. So for the orientation, who or what are the involved in the story and when and where did it take place? So help the listeners to identify the time, place, persons, activity, and situation of the story, characterized by the past continuous verbs and adjuncts. See the A3, which is of time, manner, and place. So, for this second category, for this part of the orientation, so the learners understand who or what is involved in the story, as well as when and where it occurred. So assist the listener in identifying the stories, time, place, people, activity, and situation in this category. So the use of past continuous verbs helps to distinguish it. As a result, assist learners in better understanding the time, place, and activity of the story. So for the third category, which is the completing action, then what happened, the core narrative category providing the what happened statement of the story. Temporally ordered narrative clauses with the verbs in the simple past or present. So for the third, as a result, the listeners comprehend the story's complicated action in this section. So for this category, it assists the listeners in understanding what they are mystified about in the story. So for the number 4, the resolution, what finally happened, recapitulates the final key event of a story and express as the last of the narrative issues close the complicating action. So for the fourth category, as a result, the listeners understand the story's final key event in this session. It aids listeners in comprehending the issue and the story's complicated action in this category. So for the number 5 category, which is the evaluation. So what function to make the point of the story clear? Includes intensifiers, modal verbs, negatives, repetition, evaluate commency, embedded speech, comparisons with unrealized events. So for this category, which is the evaluation, as a result, the listeners understand the functions to make the point of the story clear in this part of the evaluation. This category aids listeners in comprehending the story's negatives, repetition, unrealized events, and commentary. So for the last category, which is CODA, CODA, how does it all end? Signals that the story has ended and brings listener back in the point at which or he she entered the narrative. Often generalized statement which is timeless in feel. So for the last category, which is the coda or for me the conclusion, so the listeners will understand will it how it all ends in this section. So in the final section, the coda, the narrator, emphasized the story's relevance by connecting it to everyday life or other events or actions that occur outside of the story frame. Listeners understand to generalize the full statement of the story at this point. So as a result, Labab's narrative model is a useful tool for explaining the significance and function of a story. Labab's model and literary narrative styles like it because it allows them to compare literary and everyday narratives, typically used in short stories about 100 words. So, stylistics and natural narrative. Stylisticians have made much of the Lababian model, not least because it enables rigorous comparisons to be drawn between literary narrative on the other hand, and the social stories told and everyday interaction on the other. However, the model's simple six-part of structure tends to make it best suited to literary narratives that are literary short, which is why stylistic application have tended to concentrate either on narrative texts of only 100 words or so on narrative within narratives, such as the sorts of the story told by individual characters within longer novel or play. Although the general application of the Lababian model to a full-length novel is theoretically viable, the replication of its six components, sometimes over many hundreds of pages of text, means that the results of a direct analysis can be less than exhilarating. However, the seeking out of shorter literary texts for natural narrative analysis is, it has to be said, rather like the drunk man who loses his keys on the way home one evening and who, on retracing his steps, looks for them only under lamplight. So, with a theoretical disclaimer duly delivered, what follows is a practical narrative exercise based around a short narrative within a narrative. So, the model's simple structure tends to make it best suited to literary narratives that are literary short. So, its application have tended to concentrate on text of 100 words or less. So, the following is a hands-on narrative exercise centered on a short narrative within a narrative. Although the Lababian model can theoretically be applied to a full-length novel, replicating its six basic components can be tedious. It has been said that looking for shorter literary or natural narrative analysis is akin to be a drunk man who loses his keys on the way home and has to retrace his steps only by lamplight. So, thank you everyone for listening this video, and that's the end of my presentation.